And we return to Varn Vlog Solo, because it's just me here tonight. And I'm telling you about what the ancients thought of as politics, and we're continuing the discussion of Aristotle. Now, I'm still debating after 3 episodes of whether or not I'm going to actually do Plato. But we'll come back to that later once we get around to more of Aristotle. We have to deal with a few distinctions from Aristotle's metaphysics to understand some more things from his politics. Now, I talked about Aristotle's notions of types and causes and subsequences and all that in the prior episode, and the relationship of politics to teleology, which is things flourish by being what is uniquely theirs. Aristotle posits that what makes humans unique is reason. Reason, however, is a virtue that has to be played out socially, even when it contemplates things that are totally asocial in nature. Therefore, man has to engage in political life, and that political life for Aristotle is found in the polis. The polis has subsequent causes, its constitution, which are given by lawgivers, etc., etc., etc. Right? Go back and watch the episode because I'm much more thorough there. But we have to get into his distinctions about what politics was. Right. Because politics for Aristotle is an episteme, excuse me. And so understanding where the episteme fits is a little bit more complicated. So for Aristotle, for example, there is theoretical philosophy, which studies objects that are motionless and separate from material things, aka things like forms. And then the unmoved mover, etc. So it does not change, is motionless, can't move, and thus also cannot be material. Then there are things that are motionless but not separate from material things, such as abstractions like numbers. Mathematics studies objects that are motionless because they're abstracted, but not separate from the material world because they're natural counting numbers are based off things you materially encounter. And then natural philosophy studies objects that are in motion and not separate from the material world. Now, where would an episteme fit in this category? And it's maybe hard to posit exactly because it pretty much seems like it must fit into the natural philosophy category, which is very different from like maybe where Plato would put it, because he would think that there's an ideal form of governance. But it's important to also know what this distinction is also about for Aristotle. So the distinction between the theoretical or theoria, the mathematical, and the praxis or natural philosophy. Well, natural philosophy isn't exactly praxis either. Is not just what the relationship to material world is according to Aristotle and to a little bit Plato, and what their relationship is to motion, like do they change or not, but also how precise they can be. So this will actually sound backwards to modern thinkers. For Aristotle, theoria can be the most precise because there's no variation amongst objects, because they don't exist in the material world. That doesn't mean that they're not existent for Aristotle. They're metaphysically existent, but they don't change. There's no antecedents and anything messing with it. So that is where the most profound knowledge comes from. Mathematics is absolutely certain because its objects are unchanging, but since there are many mathematical objects of any given kind, mathematical proofs require a particular method, which Aristotle calls abstraction, removing the mathematical from its particular instantiation to abstract, cut away. And then natural philosophy for Aristotle would be the least exact because of the diversity and variability of natural things, and thus requiring attention to the particular empirical facts. Right? Studies on nature, including things like cosmology, biology, and psychology, are a large part of what Aristotle concerned himself with, even though that's not what we're interested in Aristotle as much today. But if you think about the controversies in like the early modern and late medieval church, or even in medieval Islam, you will see Aristotle's categories really matter. So politics there is a little bit harder to parse, but since it's tied to ethics, it does seem like it is still in the realm of natural knowledge. But this gets a little bit complicated because the teleos, or the purpose or goal or final end in Aristotle, is not something that changes. Like when I use the word teleology, I often talk about it in almost an existentialist way, which a teleology is something that we choose to develop for. So technologies have a teleos, right? Because they're designed to do something and they either do it or don't. And then what they do based off that design, they can deviate from their teleos through usage that's for a different manner. And, I think that's what a machine becomes, is how it's used, not what it's originally designed for. And teleos in this way is one of the ways Aristotle explains it. But Aristotle thinks this applies to everything, and that this is in the category of theoria, because the ends don't change. What is unique to a being is unique to the being in every instance. That is why it is essential. Whereas what is not unique to a being cannot be unique in every instance, even though it's in more things, because that's not part of its definition. Remember, what Aristotle's trying to get around is this kind of almost, in Buddhist epistemology, relative dependent ideas about what things are. But this, again, seems a little weird to tie into politics. Now, for Aristotle, all virtue is because one is chooses to do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. This is similar to Kant and deontology. And that is living a life that flourishes. But for Aristotle, what is the most important virtue is tied to the logos, which means both speech and reason. It's the origin of logic in English. But all the ologies, logos. Human beings alone have the ability to speak, or at least in a way that anyone can understand, that we'd actually have to rephrase this now. But from Aristotle's observation, that is the case. And thus, since they have the ability to speak, which is a social action, that also shows their reasoning. To speak and to reason are tied together. Hence, all the conceptions of barbarians being irrational. It is ethnocentrism, but it also follows from this line of logic. So for Aristotle, human beings discover things rather than create them. They don't get to decide what the virtues are. They just discover what virtues cause things to thrive the most. And picking the right things creates new things. It is a praxis that enables poiesis. But we don't get to decide what makes us happy, according to Aristotle. We don't have an existentialist gambit that we can commit to. So one has to cultivate not only a personal virtue, but the context for being virtuous. So theoria here then moves into a natural science, an episteme. So you can see here, there is both a metaphysical grounding and a natural scientific demand. And this comes from teleos, which is the thing that brings them together. Now, this is foreign to a lot of modern thinking, even though I said a lot of people have a folk Aristotelian idea about politics, is that politics is supposed to enable humans to thrive. And, you know, most modern and even most liberal political thinkers would tell you that's kind of a joke. But that is the Aristotelian gambit. And the reason why is the teleos. Reason and speech are intimately tied together. Speech is a social act, but it proves your ability to reason. You must create the context for ideal speech because it shows ideal reason, and thus being able to live in manifestation of that ideal speech through action. So one can embody, not just say. And that requires a virtuous context and environment, which requires politics. So just like I said, you could not say that politics is the ethical, but you can't separate the two in Aristotle. You also can't say that politics is just pure theoria, which is almost what it is for Plato, because the enacting of it in the particular instance limits its universality, even though it's the universal that drives it. So we can study it in its universal teleological manifestations, or we can look at the natural science of it. And Aristotle actually seems to think that looking at the natural science of it may give you more hints into getting into the theoretical, but that basically the link between that is a kind of ethical understanding of being. Or to put it to you another way, politics for Aristotle is to provide an environment that the people, the right people, the people who can. Now, Aristotle believes in different kinds of people and natural slaves and stuff like that. Women, all kinds of stuff that he would exempt from this. But only they can be fully human and live ethical and happy lives. I mean, ethical, for example, Aristotle does not think poor people can easily be ethical because they do not have the wealth to be generous and to spend time in reasoning. And that means we have to not just create a political context for that to happen in, but we also have to do it in a correct way. And again, we can see this in the ethics. This is an Aristotelian quote. We become just by the practice of just action, self-control by exercising self-control, and courageous by performing acts of courage. Lawmakers make the citizens good by inculcating good habits in them. You know, this is actually a way of transference, and this is the aim of every lawgiver. If he does not succeed in doing that, his legislation is a failure. It is this that a good constitution differs from a bad one. So we can see here this move from the theoretical to the natural. And this Aristotle's political naturalism. So what Aristotle is concerned with primarily is understanding how we can achieve something like accordance with these metaphysical goals through practical life. Thus, the relationship to theory and praxis that you see in people like Moses Hess and Marx. Actually, Aristotle's crucial for this. Now, Marx doesn't have the same framework I've talked about before, how he leaves out poesis. There's all kinds of other issues about Marx Aristotelianism and how, I mean, basically it's a Hegelian reading of Aristotle. But this is important to understand the political philosophy in Marx. Except, again, Marx is flipping Hegel on his head and thus also kind of tilting Aristotle's a little bit. So, in the politics, which is heavily debated whether or not it's a completed text, whether it was just like lecture notes and half-minute essays and shit like that. I mean, they weren't half finished, but you get what I mean. Like, how formal of a text was this? Like, the Poetics was also probably not a formal text. And it does seem like a lot of what we have from Aristotle is lecture notes, basically. The things like the former dialogues, which are quoted as existing but not quoted. So we don't have a lot of, like, we don't have fragments of them, but they are mentioned as existing. You know, we also don't have the corresponding lecture text from Plato. We have the dialogue. So it's kind of an interesting textual reception history there. All right. So the defining subject of Aristotle, and if one hears this subject stuff and like the subject of history, well, this does lead back to Aristotle, is a city, the polis, or the political partnership. Now, I've already talked about how the actual polises work. To call them cities is a little misleading because because the metropolis actually was a dominated political entity, and there was demes, which were kind of subsidiary cities, and they were under the rule of the metropole, and all these are defined constitutionally, and that a lot of other political arrangements in the ancient world are either relatively stable empires or kingships, see the ancient Near East, or they're kings of peoples. Some of those peoples are not sedentary, like the kings of the Goths, the kings of the Huns of a later period. It's unclear to me, for example, whether the Macedonians were actually all that sedentary before Philip and Alexander. I just need to read up more on it. I don't know much of Macedonian history before that. All right. So even though we have politics assigned in a very different way because of this theoria or theoretical, going back and forth between my botched ancient Greek and modern English, and the natural sciences, we also have, his definition of what things were, what makes them natural, how they correspond to different types. So what is the purpose of a city? So while Aristotle's definition of what a polis is would actually match with ours of any polity, you can even hear the word, and polity, politics, polity, all these things are related to these, quote, city-states. What is interesting is Aristotle sees a polis as a political partnership, meaning those who participate as citizens are partners in the polis. They are not just subjects, even though they are the subject of the polis, nor are they just people who happen to be born in the territory and thus bound by some, force or unstated social contract, which may or may not have ever happened in the past, that binds them together. The citizens of political communities for Aristotle are partners, and they are to pursue a common good for the good of all the partners. And for Aristotle, the good of the city, which creates the context which people can enact their reason, see this, I want to reiterate this way of thinking that he's going through, is actually the most authoritative good, or the highest good, because it provides this context of inculcating virtue into people and allowing them to live in regards to their teleos, which allows them to flourish. Now, this might sound interesting because Aristotle is not always all that democratic in the way he thinks that the idea of constitutions could work and should work. I mean, neither he nor Plato nor Proclus or a lot of the ancient writers that we may bring up in this time do that. But he does fundamentally think that the citizens share in the regime and they create excellence collectively and thus enable individual excellence to happen through that. All right. And in fact, it is the pursuit of virtues or strengths that make a city, and that its citizens are partnership in the regime, even if they do not all get a vote. And remember, there's a lot of people excluded from citizenship in this framework. So we have to go back to the ethics, but there's another quote from the ethics here. And this is again from Aristotle. The end of politics is the best of ends, and the main concern of politics is to engender a certain character in its citizens and to make them good and disposed in noble actions. This is not just to create a law-abiding citizens, because law-abidingness in and of itself for Aristotle would not necessarily be a good. The law-abidingness is only useful if the laws are in accordance with virtue. And again, this is totally foreign to modern politics, except for like, you know, some liberal do-goodery here or there. So interestingly, politics requires a more active participation and a control in developing character or a virtuous type than most modern people would want. All right. This would, in some ways, be what we would modernly call a totalitarian or an authoritarian society, but one in which every citizen is a full partner. Now, again, with the caveats on who citizens are for Aristotle. That isn't everybody. All right. So Aristotle, interestingly, does not pull from the same kind of theoretical concerns as Plato. Plato starts about talking about politics in a theoretical, almost esoteric way. There's weird stories in the Republic that are hard to explain, just in terms of political or ethical writing. It's unclear if parts of the Republic are satirical, or utopian, or what. So Aristotle flips back and treats this like a natural science again. And remember, he doesn't think natural sciences can be precise, even though ultimately the goal is a metaphysical goal, the alignments of human life with the form of human life, which is found through logos, which is enacted by speech and reason, etc., etc., etc. Remember, we know people reason because they speak, and it's reflected in the word logos, which means both speech act and logic. We can see here that we are dealing with something kind of more foreign than you probably thought when you first started learning that we were going to talk about Aristotle. But you can also see the traces on later philosophers. Aristotle and Plato are behind the mask of a lot of modern philosophy, even if their concerns are kind of alien to it. Maybe even what we would call ideological, but we'll come back to that. So Aristotle starts with an axiomatic definition of the city, which is almost which is derived from a metaphysical or formal theoretical presumption. He gives it a purpose, but we can only study that purpose by seeing it enacted. So we move from theory to natural science. Now we skip the mathematics on this one. Remember, that's the other category. And he talks about this in even topics. Generally, it's generally accepted are means that are accepted by everyone or by the majority or by the philosophers, i.e., or by the majority are the most noble or illustrious of them. So he thinks this is how he defines we should begin with examining opinions. We should start with the most common amongst the educated or the most common in general, depending on the topic. All right. These opinions for Aristotle are doxa. All right. You might hear the word doxa, you know it from orthodox or heterodox, but doxa here means truth. So they are not completely true, but not completely false. So they have to be systemically examined so that they can be determined. So you have an almost imminent critique here, the kind of thing, again, that you'll see in later political thinkers like Marx. Aristotle thinks we can arrive at truth by looking over these partially true, partially false, generally accepted statements and working through their contradictions in practice. He might be setting out an argument to challenge it. It might even be hard to tell what position Aristotle is taking when he's writing about it. But we have to deal with that. So Aristotle takes up a key opinion that he begins when he talks about politics, and that is, politics the same as other kinds of rules, such as kings over their subjects? Note that might not entirely be political for Aristotle. Fathers over their wives and children in the family are masters over their slaves. And he doesn't think any of these are totally analogous to what the state does. All right. So Aristotle then goes on to say how city-states come into being. And this is actually weirdly similar to like someone like Hobbes, several thousand years, well, about 1,000 and some change years later. So political partnerships came out of desperation, and Aristotle believes that they came because persons cannot exist without one another. We're kind of bad animals by ourselves. Look at our claws. For those of you who are listening, I'm holding up my not very clawy hands. Look at our teeth. I can tear flesh with this, but not easily. Look at our strength, even compared to other primates. A bonobo, not the most vicious of primates, can rip my face off. Right? The ancients weren't stupid. They knew this. Someone probably got in a fight with a bonobo once. So the idea is humans are dominant because of reason, because we sure as hell aren't dominant because of our strength. And we also can't really survive well alone. Exile in most cases means finding another tribe or dying. All right. And he starts with two pairs, and even though we've talking about like fathers over their wives can't be and children is not really the good analogy for politics, he does think that the first pair is a reproductive pair. The social reproduction, use kind of a Marxist way of talking about this, is the origins of politics, because survival requires more of you. Now, this sounds reasonable to a lot of us, I think. But then Aristotle goes on that there are the naturally ruled and the ruling on the account of preservation. Now, this is different from Hobbes. Hobbes thinks that we submit to a ruler out of survival reasons, but we're all essentially equal. I mean, he's doing the whole I'm going to accept all the liberal premises and show you how it leads to illiberal ends thing. That's really Hobbes's gambit there. But in some ways, Hobbes is both the first fully ostentulated liberal and fully ostentulated anti-liberal simultaneously. But Aristotle thinks that slavery comes out of self-preservation, that the slave is naturally a loser who lost in a battle. And he means this literally, not like some metaphysical loser or just like someone who's not good at stuff. No, you had a battle, you lost it. You agreed to serve a person out of self-preservation because that is the price of your life. All right. And thus, for Aristotle, and again, we see Hegel pulling from this later, although he inverts this, the ruling master and the ruled slave naturally exist to preserve each other. The ruling master needs labor. The ruled slave needs the protection, and also the master not killing him or her. All right. Now, I know it's weird for us to think, and for good reason, that anyone would think that a master-slave relationship benefits anybody. This is Aristotle's logic. Now, again, if we look at what Hegel does with the master-slave dialectic, he almost inverts this. I say almost because it's still unclear. Because for Hegel, the natural actor is actually the slave who forces self-reflection upon the master. For Aristotle, the master is the mover because he won. And that shows a natural disposition towards rulership. It is aristocratic. Aris means fighting. All right. But this is still within the realm of a family unit, believe it or not. And slaves are in the realm of a tribal unit. We're not near a polis yet. And Aristotle thinks that the first people to hold slaves were not states, but families that could force it. And then families combine to form a tribe and a village. And villages are better than families because they are more self-sufficient. And you can see this thought. So there's a teleological development here. The family is a rudimentary form, but it can't be said to be the same thing as the better form, which is the village. Villages are larger than families. People can specialize their labor and develop more skills such as cooking, medicine, building, fighting, etc. They could not develop in small subsistence bands. Now, we actually know the anthropology of this doesn't so much work out this way, but this is what Aristotle thought. And you see this thinking permeated even into modern political thought. As far as some of this feels, some of this is still with a lot of even liberal thinkers. All right, so villages lead more comfortable lives as long as you're, a master, with more access to goods and services and more people who can specialize. And the most significant change of amount into kind, or, from a small thing to a big thing that changes the nature of the thing, again, something you see in Hegel, is that a city is a culmination of villages that is not the same as just a big village. So the partnership of several different cities arises, of several different villages arises to complete a polis. And a polis is the full level of self-sufficiency for Aristotle. Now, we would laugh at this, like, okay, so basically, like a state and a city and its suburbs are the maximum political unit. Well, we always have a weird assuming, just like we do with nation states today, that the natural political unit is the one that we happen to live in. So maybe we should be a little bit less judgy of Aristotle here than in other places, since we also do the same shit. But that's just me warning you about your own parochialism, probably. All right. So, and this is where Aristotle thinks this becomes a change in kind. It's not just a change in amount. So the villages, people can live okay. But in the city, people can live well. They can begin to have enough surplus to enact their reason. And this is why the polis, as I explained last time, is so crucial. But also, these collections of villages are more thought out. They have a more theoretical basis due to laws and constitutions. Which means I need to stop here because I don't want to get into what the constitutions are, because this is the part of Aristotle you've probably heard before. The category of both the three types of good constitutions and the three types of bad constitutions. That also informs Proclus and is hidden at in Plato. You know that thing. So this is what you need to understand to get everything you need from the beginnings of Aristotle's politics. Because I realized when I did the first video that I was explaining you the kinds and causes and the Aristotle's definitions of things and what that means. but you also needed to understand his different categories of knowledge. And that as an episteme, the closest thing we can think of for politics for him is a science, but it's a science that has a theoretical grounding. And for Aristotle, a theoretical grounding is a metaphysical grounding. It is not just speculation. All right. That's a lesson for today. We have a lot more to do. I know I promised the 13 ways of looking at third worldism. I might start that too, but I'm also giving individual topics as they come up. But I am not forgetting the third world as promised. I promised him when I do that, and I'm going to do it. But we're going to do, we might do Aristotle. I'm probably thinking about 5 sessions. We've already done one, and then one on the general context of the ancients. Hopefully by the time we've done that, I'm going to decide if I'm going to go back and cover Plato or not. I'm still leaning no, because Plato's thought is weirder. And even though I've actually read more Plato than Aristotle, I feel like I still don't have a grasp on all that Plato is getting at, whereas I do have a grasp of what Aristotle is getting at. And I think that Aristotle is more influential on early modern European politics, which means he's more influential to liberalism, even though he's not a liberal in any way, form, or fashion, and thus more influential to also anti-liberal forms of thinking, because they all kind of have this baggage in the background. You know, if you're in some European or post-European, like the settler and colonial states are, if you are, you know, from a Confucian or a Dharmic background, the assumptions about politics are actually somewhat different. And there are non-Aristotelian political traditions in the West, aka Europe. But I would go on to say that they probably are going to sound even more foreign or even more religious to you. We'll maybe get to them eventually, because I'm not stopping with Aristotle. We'll just take breaks on this series because, you know, I just don't want to do this forever. We'll see how you guys respond to that. Anyway, if you want more, like and subscribe, hit the bell. There's more behind the Patreon wall, and we got all kinds of stuff to do here. Protect your peace, learn as much as you can, and know that ancient philosophers don't think the way we often try to render them as thinking. They are alien to us. The past is more than a foreign country, actually. It might be an entirely different dimension. I'm probably overstating that, but not by much. And I'm not saying that humans aren't fundamentally what we are now. I mean, modern Homo sapiens sapiens, modern humans and modern human brains have been fairly static for most of our history. But I will remind you, most of our history as even Homo sapiens sapiens were not in settled agricultural settlements. They were mostly in hunter-gatherer bands, and mostly in that subsistence hunter-gatherer bands that were relatively egalitarian internally. Now, externally is a different matter. And also, hunter-gatherer bands differed radically on how they treated women. So we can be a little, you know, sometimes anarchists are a little bit too forgiving of hunter-gatherer bands, or they like extrapolate off the cool ones and ignore the ones that don't fit their patterns. But I bring this up because in some ways, when we talk about what makes us human, agricultural settlements wouldn't make sense even from Aristotle's conception, because they're such a late development. But he would say, no, but they're a late development that enabled us to fully live our lives and finally be human and blah, blah, blah. When you hear Marxists will occasionally say stuff like, full humanity is not possible until communism, they're echoing this Aristotelian way of thinking. All right. The pitch was intermixed with the lesson. I'm bad at this. So, like and subscribe, hit the bell. We have a Patreon. You can get access to it for little as $4. I have tiers up to $15 a month if you really want to support me. And those people get to help me come up with topics. Although, if you leave a comment and I find it particularly interesting, you can also sometimes inspire a topic or a rant or at least a subsection where I'm talking shit in one of these videos. So, participate. I'll try to make it worth your while. If you don't, that's also cool. And if you hate me, well, if you leave a comment, you're helping me anyway, even if it's a negative one. So have a great day and protect your peace. You're going to need it, particularly if you're going to read Aristotle, because some of it's maddening. Fucking Aristotle.